History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 4 Political Change The Anglo Saxon World. This was a leading question, though one historians still sometimes ask, without thinking about its implications, that there exist certain conditions which make revolution likely and that British society seems to have fulfilled them. It may be, rather, that no such propositions need to be conceded. Perhaps there never was a potentially revolutionary threat in this rapidly changing society. Many of the basic changes which the French Revolution brought to Europe had already existed in Great Britain for centuries, after all. The fundamental institutions, however rusty or encrusted with inconvenient historic accretion they might be, offered large possibilities. Even in unreformed days, the House of Commons and House of Lords were not the closed corporate institutions which were all that was available in many European states. Already before 1832, they had shown their capacity to meet new needs, even if slowly and belatedly. The first Factory Act, not admittedly a very effective one, had been passed as early as 1801. Once 1832 was passed, then there were good grounds for thinking that if Parliament were only pressed hard enough from the outside, it would carry out any reforms that were required. There was no legal restraint on its power to do so. Even the oppressed and angry seem to have seen this. There were many outbreaks of desperate violence and many revolutionaries about in the 1830s and 1840s, which were especially hard times for the poor. But it is striking that the most important popular movement of the day, the great spectrum of protest, gathered together in what was called Chartism, asked in the People's Charter, which was its program for measures which would make Parliament more responsive to popular needs, not for its abolition. Yet, it is not likely that Parliament would have been called upon to provide reforms unless other factors had operated. Here it is perhaps significant that the great reforms of Victorian England were all ones which interested the middle classes as much as the masses, with the possible exception of factory legislation. The English middle class came to an early share in political power, as its continental counterparts had not, and could therefore use it to obtain change. It was not tempted to ally with revolution, the recourse of desperate men to whom other avenues were closed. But in any case, it does not seem that the English masses were themselves very revolutionary. At any rate, their failure to act in a revolutionary way has caused much distress to later left wing historians. Whether this is because their sufferings were too great, not great enough, or whether simply there were too many differences between different sections of the working class has been much disputed. But it is at least worth noticing, as did contemporary visitors, that in England traditional patterns of behavior died hard. It was long to remain a country with habits of deference to social superiors, which forcibly struck foreigners, especially Americans. Moreover, there were working class organizations which provided alternatives to revolution. They were often Victorian in their admirable emphasis on self help, caution, prudence, sobriety. Of the elements making up the great English labor movement, only the political party which bears that name was not in existence already before 1840. The others were mature by the 1860s. The Friendly Societies for Insurance Against Misfortune, the cooperative associations, and above all, the trades unions all provided effective channels for personal participation in the improvement of working class life, even if at first only to a few and slowly. This early maturity was to underlie the paradox of English socialism, its later dependence on a very conservative and unrevolutionary trade union movement for a long while, the largest in the world. Once the 1840s were over, economic trends may have helped to allay discontent. At any rate, working class leaders often said so, almost regretfully. They at least thought that betterment told against a revolutionary danger in England. As the international economy picked up in the 1850s, good times came to the industrial cities of a country which was the workshop of the world, and its merchant, banker, and insurance too. As employment and wages rose, the support which the Chartists had mustered crumbled away, and they were soon only a reminiscence. The symbols of the unchanging form, which contained so much change, were the central institutions of the kingdom, Parliament and the Crown. When the Palace of Westminster was burnt down and a new one was built, a mock medieval design was chosen to emphasize the antiquity of what would come to be called the Mother of Parliaments. The violent changes of most revolutionary era of British history thus continued to be masked by the robes of customs and tradition. Above all, the monarchy continued. Already in 1837, when Victoria ascended the throne, it was second only to the papacy in antiquity among the political institutions of Europe. Yet it was much changed in reality, for all that. It had been brought very low in public esteem by George III's successor, the worst of English kings, and not much enhanced by his heir. Victoria and her husband were to make it unquestionable, except by a very few Republicans. In part, this was against the grain for the Queen herself. She did not pretend to like the political neutrality appropriate to a constitutional monarch when the crown had withdrawn above the political battle. Nonetheless, it was in her reign that this withdrawal was seen to be made. She also domesticated the monarchy. For the first time since the days of the young George III, the phrase the royal family was a reality and could be seen to be such. It was one of the many ways in which her German husband, Prince Albert, helped her, though he got little thanks for it from an ungrateful English public. Only in Ireland did their capacity for imaginative change seem always to fail the British people. They had faced a real revolutionary danger and had had to put down a rebellion there in 1798. In the 1850s and 1860s, things were quiet, but the reason was in large measure an appalling disaster which overtook Ireland in the middle of the 1840s, when the failure of the potato crop was followed by famine, disease, and thus brutally a Malthusian solution of Ireland's overpopulation. For the moment, the demand for the repeal of the Act of Union, which had joined her to the Great Britain in 1801, was muted. The dislike of her predominantly Catholic population for an alien and established Protestant church was in abeyance, and there was no serious disturbance among a peasant population feeling no loyalty to absentee English landlords, or for that matter, to the resident but equally grasping and more numerous Irish landlords, who exploited tenant and laborer alike. Problems nonetheless remained, and the Liberal government, which took office in 1868, addressed itself to some of them. The only significant consequence appeared to be the emergence of a new Irish nationalist movement, based on the Roman Catholic peasantry and demanding home rule. Dispute over what this might, let alone ought to, mean was to haunt British politics, overturn their combinations, and wreck attempts to settle the Irish question for a century and more. In the short run, it promoted two rival Irish revolutionary movements, North and South, and contributed to the wrecking of British liberalism. Thus, Ireland, after 1,000 years, began again to make a visible mark on the world history, though, of course, she had already made one less obviously earlier in the century through the immigration of so many of her people to the United States of America. Chapter 5: The European World Hegemony. By 1900, the peoples of Europe and European stocks overseas dominated the globe. They did so in many ways, some explicit and some implicit. But the qualifications matter less than the general fact. For the most part, the world responded to European initiatives and marched increasingly to European tunes. This was a unique development in world history. For the first time, a civilization established itself as a leader worldwide. One minor consequence is that the remainder of this book will be increasingly concerned with a single global history. Indeed, by 1940, by 1914, the first climax of what is now called globalization had been reached. It is important not to think only of the direct formal rule of the majority of the world's land surface by European states. Some people would prefer the term Western, but this is unnecessarily finicky. The Americas and antipodes are dominated by culture of European origin, not of Asian or African, and is also liable to mislead because of the use of that word recently in a narrow political sense. There is economic and cultural hegemony to be considered, and European ascendancy was often expressed in influence as well as in overt control. The important distinction is between European forces, which are aggressive, shaping manipulative and indigenous cultures, and peoples, which are the objects of those forces and not often able to resist them effectively. It was by no means always to the disadvantage of non Europeans that this was so, but they tended almost always to be the underdogs, those who had to adapt to Europeans' world. At times, they did so willingly when they succumbed to the attractive force of Europe's progressive ideals, or most subtly of all, to new sets of expectations aroused by European teachings and example. One way of envisaging the Europeans' world of 1900 is as a succession of concentric circles. The innermost was old Europe itself, which had grown in wealth and population for 3 centuries thanks to an increasing mastery, first of its own and then of the world's resources. Europeans distinguished themselves more and more from other human beings by taking and consuming a growing share of the world's goods and by the energy and skill they showed in manipulating their environment. The civilization was already rich in the 19th century and was all the time getting richer. Industrialization had confirmed its self feeding capacity to open up and create new resources. Furthermore, the power generated by new wealth made possible the appropriation of the wealth of other parts of the world. The profits of Congo rubber, Burmese teak, or Persian oil would not for a long time be reinvested in those countries. The poor European and American benefited from low prices for raw materials, and improving mortality rates tell the story of an industrial civilization finding it possible to give its peoples a richer life. Even the European peasants could buy cheap manufactured clothes and tools, while his contemporaries in Africa and India still lived in the Stone Age. This wealth was shared by the second circle of European hegemony, that of the European cultures transplanted overseas. The United States is the greatest example. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the countries of South America make up the list. They did not all stand on the same footing towards the Old World, but together with Europe proper they were what is sometimes called the Western world, an unhelpful expression since they are scattered all around the globe. Yet it seeks to express an important fact, the similarity of the ideas and institutions from which they were sprung. Of course, these were not all that had shaped them. They all had their distinctive frontiers. They all had faced special environmental challenges and unique historical circumstances. But what they had in common were ways of dealing with these challenges, institutions which different frontiers would reshape in different ways. They were all formally Christian. No one ever settled new lands in the name of atheism until the 20th century. All regulated their affairs by European systems of law, and all had access to the great cultures of Europe with which they shared their languages. In 1900, this world was sometimes called the civilized world. It was called that just because it was a world of shared standards. The confident people who used the phrase could not easily see that there was much else deserving of the name of the civilization in the world. When they looked for it, they tended to see only heathen, backward, benighted peoples, or a few striving to join the civilized. This was one reason why Europeans were so successful. What were taken to be demonstrations of the inherent superiority of European ideas and values nerved men to fresh assaults on the world and inspired fresh incomprehension of it. The progressive values of the 18th century provided new arguments for superiority to reinforce those originally stemming from religion. By 1800, Europeans had lost most of the respect they had once showed for other civilizations. Their own social practice seems obviously superior to the unintelligible barbarities found elsewhere. The advocacy of individual rights, a free press, universal suffrage, the protection of women and children, and even the animals from exploitation have been ideals pursued right down to our own day in other lands by Europeans and Americans, often wholly unconscious that they might be inappropriate. Philanthropists and progressives long continued to be confident that the values of European civilization should be universalized, as were its medicine and sanitation, even when deploring other assertions of European superiority. Science, too, has often seemed to point in the same direction to the destruction of superstition and the bringing of blessings of a rational exploitation of resources. The provision of formal education, and the suppression of backward social customs, there was a well nigh universal assumption that the values of European civilization were better than indigenous ones. Obviously, too, they often were, and a large obliviousness to any disruptive effects they might have. Fortunately, it was thought for the peoples of some of the lands over which thick darkness brooded yet, as one Victorian hymn put it. They were by 1900 often ruled directly by Europeans or European stocks. Subject peoples formed the third concentric circle through which European civilization radiated outwards. In many colonies, enlightened administrators toiled to bring the blessings of railway, Western education, hospitals, law, and order to peoples whose own institutions had clearly failed. It was taken as evidence of their inadequacy that they had failed to stand up to the challenge and competition of a superior civilization. Even when native institutions were protected and preserved, It was from a position which assumed the superiority of culture of the colonial power. A consciousness of such superiority is no longer admired or admissible, even if secretly cherished. In one respect, nevertheless, it achieved an end which the most scrupulous critics of colonialism still accept as good, even when suspecting the motives behind it. This was the abolition of slavery in the European world and the deployment of force and diplomacy to combat it even in countries Europeans did not control. The crucial steps were taken in 1807 and 1834 when the British Parliament abolished first the trade in slaves and then slavery itself within the British Empire. This action by the major naval, imperial, and commercial power was decisive. Similar measures were soon enforced by other European nations, and slavery finished in the United States in 1865. The end of the process may be reckoned to be the emancipation of slaves in Brazil in 1888, at which date colonial governments and the Royal Navy were pressing hard on the operations of Arab slave traders in the African continent and the Indian Ocean. Many forces, intellectual, religious, economic, and political, went into this great achievement, and debate about their precise individual significance continues. It is perhaps worth pointing out here that though it was only after 300 years and more of large scale slave trading that abolition came, Europe's is also the only civilization which has ever eradicated slavery for itself. Though in the present century slavery briefly returned to Europe, it could not be sustained except by force, nor was it openly avowable as slavery. It cannot have been much consolation to their unhappy occupants, but the forced labor camps of our own century were run by men who had to pay the tribute of hypocrisy to virtue either by denying their existence or by disguising their slaves as the subjects of re education or judicial punishment. Beyond this outermost circle of directly ruled territories lay the rest of the world. Its peoples were shaped by Europe too. Sometimes their values and institutions were corroded by contact with it, as was the case in the Chinese and Ottoman empires. And this might lead to indirect European political interference as well as the weakening of traditional authority. Sometimes they were stimulated by such contacts and exploited them. Japan is the only example of an important nation doing this with success. What was virtually impossible was to remain untouched by Europe. The busy, bustling energy of the European trader would alone have seen to that. In fact, it was in the areas which were not directly ruled by the Europeans which make the point of European supremacy most forcibly of all. European values were transferred on the powerful wings of aspiration and envy. Geographical remoteness was almost the only security, but even Tibet was invaded by the British in 1904. Ethiopia is virtually the solitary example of successful independence. It survived British and Italian invasion in the 19th century, but of course had the important moral advantage of claiming to be a Christian country, albeit not a Western one, and only intermittently for some 14 centuries. Whoever opened the door, a whole civilization was likely to try to follow them through it. But one of the most important agencies in bringing European civilization to the rest of the world had always been Christianity, because of its virtually limitless interest in all sides of human behavior. The territorial spread of the organized churches and the growth in their numbers of official adherents in the 19th century made this the greatest age of Christian expansion since apostolic times. Much of this was the result of a renewed wave of missionary activity. New orders were set up by the Catholics. New societies for support of overseas missions appeared in Protestant countries. Yet, the paradoxical effect was the intensifying of the European flavor of what was supposedly a creed for all sorts and conditions of men. In most of the receiving countries, Christianity was long seen as just one more aspect of European civilization, rather than as a spiritual message which might use a local idiom. An interesting, if trivial, example was the concern missionaries often showed over dress. Whereas the Jesuits in the 17th century China had discreetly adopted the costume of their hosts, their 19th century successors set to work with zeal to put Bantus and Solomon Islanders into European garments, which were often of almost freakish unsuitability. This was one way in which Christian missionaries diffused more than a religious message. Often, too, they brought important material and technical benefits food in time of famine, agricultural techniques, hospitals and schools, some of which could be disruptive of the societies which received them. Through them, filtered the assumptions of a progressive civilization. The ideological confidence of European missionaries and non missionaries alike could rest in the last resort on the knowledge that they could not be kept away, even from countries which were not colonized. There appeared to be no part of the world where Europeans could not, if they wished, impose themselves by armed strength. The development of weapons in the 19th century gave Europeans an even greater relative advantage than they had enjoyed when the first Portuguese broadside was fired at Calicut. Even when advanced devices were available to other peoples, they could rarely deploy them effectively. At the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898, a British regiment opened fire on its opponents at 2,000 yards range with the ordinary magazine rifle of the British Army of the day. Soon afterwards, shrapnel shell and machine guns were shredding into pieces the masses of the Mahadist army, who never reached the British line. By the end of the battle, 10,000 of them had been killed for a loss of 48 British and Egyptian soldiers. It was not, though, as an Englishman put it soon afterwards, simply the case that whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. For the Khalifa had machine guns in his armory at Omurdurman too. He also had telegraph apparatus to communicate with his forces and electric mines to blow up the British gunboats on the Nile. But none of these things were properly employed. Not only a technical but a mental transformation was required before non European cultures could turn the instrumentations of the Europeans against them. There was also one other sense, more benevolent and less disagreeable, in which European civilization rested upon force. This was because of the Pax Britannica, which throughout the whole 19th century stood in the way of European nations fighting each other for mastery of the non European world. There was to be no rerun on the colonial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 19th century, although the greatest extension of direct colonial rule in modern times was then going on, traders of all nations could move without let or hindrance on the surface of the seas. British naval supremacy was a precondition of the informal expansion of the European civilization. It guaranteed, above all, the international framework of trade whose center by 1900 was Europe. The old peripheral exchanges by a few merchants and enterprising captains had, from the 17th century onwards, been replaced gradually by integrated relationships of interdependence based on a broad distinction of role between industrial and non industrial countries. The second tended to be primary producers meeting the needs of the increasingly urbanized populations of the first. But this crude distinction needs much qualification. Individual countries often do not fit in. The United States, for example, was both a great primary producer and the world's leading manufacturing power in 1914, with an outpost as great as those of Great Britain, France, and Germany together. Nor was this distinction one which ran exactly between nations of European and non European culture. Japan and Russia were both industrializing faster than China or India in 1914. But Russia, though European, Christian, and imperialist, could certainly not be regarded as a developed nation. And most Japanese, like most Russians, were still peasants, nor could a developed economy be found in Balkan Europe. All that can be asserted is that in 1914, a nucleus of the advanced countries existed with social and economic structures quite different than those of traditional society, and that these were the core of the Atlantic group of nations, which was increasingly the world's main producer and consumer.